So, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Ayana Jones. I'm the ID Mentorship Program Manager for IDSA Foundation. Thank you again for this coming to crafting your unique research pathway. This is a part of our ID Mentorship 365 webinar series. And special thanks to our speakers who will introduce here shortly. But before I turn over the program to our moderator, we just have a few housekeeping matters. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. If you can't stay for the entire presentation, the presentation will be uploaded to our Cooper lessons, or you can access it and share it via our website, via our YouTube channel. So we'll make sure to share both of those links to you after the webinar is up. You'll notice that your microphones are currently muted, but feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions during the speaker's presentations. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentations where you can unmute yourself and turn on your cameras and show your faces. But yeah, while they're presenting, just add your questions to the Q&A portion. And then if we can't get to all the questions during the live event, we can address them in a follow-up email. So yeah, feel free to email me. I'll add our email address at the end of the presentation. And then finally, as you all know, we're on social media at IDSA Foundation across all platforms. Feel free to post or share your takeaway from the webinar there. Tag us and use the hashtag. It's hashtag IDM365. So yeah, now with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, IDSA's Mentorship and Recruitment Co-Chair, Dr. Layla Wolk-Colburn. If you all do not know Dr. Layla Wolk-Colburn, she's an associate professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Emory University School of Medicine. She's also a passionate clinical educator, and she completed her fellowship at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio, which is also my hometown and where I am right now. So a special place in my heart. We're happy to have Dr. Layla moderating today. So I will pass it over to her.
Thank you for that introduction, Ayana. As I said, as Ayana says, I'm Dr. Layla Wolk-Colburn, or Doc Walk, if you go by my Twitter handle or Instagram. I'm thrilled to initiate the first webinar in our ID Mentorship 365 webinar series. As you can see, we have changed our name, and it's to embrace our uniqueness of that every single day we should be thinking about mentoring. As a reminder, our speakers will discuss best practice in delivering engaging, tailored presentations for diverse audiences in infectious diseases. In this webinar, we'll delve into the realm of ID research, something that a lot of you are always asking on how to get engaged and what to do. Our speakers will help you understand how to tailor your research agenda and balance your clinical and research pursuits. They also will provide insights on grants, promoting diversity and inclusion in your search, and navigating the nuisances of process of tenure, especially if you go into academics. Next slide, please. Now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Andrej Spec. He is a very dear friend. We've worked together in a couple of committees, as well as the Open Forum Infectious Diseases, as he's the associate editor. Dr. Andrej Spec earned his medical degree at the University of Illinois in Chicago and did his internal medicine training at Rush University Medical Center. He came to Washington University in St. Louis for his fellowship, and he committedly earned his Master of Science in Clinical Investigation. He stayed there as faculty, where he focused his research and clinical work on invasive fungal infections. To say he's also my go-to guy when we have fungal questions to ask. He is currently an associate professor at Washington University in St. Louis, where he also serves as the associate director of Infectious Disease Clinical Research Unit. and the medical co-director of the Invasive Mycosis Clinical and section director of Transplant Infectious Diseases. He has authored more than 80 scientific papers and several book chapters on invasive fungal infections. He also serves as interim co-editor-in-chief on Open Forum Infectious Disease and currently is deputy editor. Dr. Spec was elected as a fellow of the European Confederation of Medical Mycologists and Infectious Disease Society in 2019 and 21, respectively. Finally, he's a developer and lead editor of the Comprehensive Reviews of Infectious Disease. If you ever had it, it's a wonderful book and textbook to use a reference, and has great figures and everything. So with that, Andrej, we are here to hear you about everything about research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wackel. I really appreciate the invitation from both from you and from IDSA Foundation. And so would you mind going on to the next slide, please? So what I'm going to talk about is how to craft your unique research pathway. And there's two components to that. One is like, how do you choose the field that you want to go into? And the other question is, how do you actually distinguish yourself within that field? And I'm going to try to cover both things, more focus on the latter than on the former, or the former than the latter. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about is, what is your interest? What is the feasibility? What does the mentorship look like? What does the space look like? What does the funding culture look like? And then how to make your own voice once you're there. Next slide, please. So the interest has to be there. You're going to spend an incredible amount of time doing the work, the time, the research, the mentorship that you will then do, and the conferences you're going to go to. So you really should pick something that you are interested in. So do you like this disease process? Is this something that makes you interested? Is this something that when you're on rounds, you actually like talking about this disease? Or is this the disease that you're talking about on rounds and you're bored yourself? If that's the case, that may not be the disease for you. And there are many diseases that a lot of people find boring that the people who are in the field will find infinitely interesting. And really, you just have to find one that works for you. The clinical management. Do you like the clinical management of these diseases? Some, they feel very, very different. Some are episodic. Some are very long-term. Some are designed to cure a person. Some are designed to slow down a disease process, ameliorate things. And so what does it feel like to actually manage this? How do you like working with the referral services? Because if you're doing clinical research, you will become the de facto person who manages these patients anyway. And so do you like this? Do you like the relationships you have, or the people you'd be working with in your institution, who are going to be referring to you, and then who you're going to be referring to make things work for those patients? And do you like the number of patients that will want your time? And that actually goes both ways. A great example of it is, if you want to do work on, schistosomiasis, and you are, in America, you're not going to have a lot of patients who are going to be taken care of. You're going to be doing a lot of Gen ID, which is totally fine. On the other hand, if you do work on something like osteomyelitis, diabetic osteomyelitis, you will have a ton of patients who are going to want your time. And everywhere on that spectrum is okay. It's just a question of what is it that you want to have. The next part is, are there clinical questions that you want to answer, that you can answer, right? So you don't want to necessarily focus going to a field where you can't think of an interesting idea. What can you do? What is a study that you can do today that can impact a person's life? And so try to think of a way that you can better understand the disease, but also a lot of clinical research really should be designed more about how do you impact an individual's life and how do you have the most impact you possibly can. Next slide, please. Then next part becomes feasibility. Can I do the research that I want to do where I am? Do I have the resources for the research? If you want to do work on, let's go back to schistosomiasis. You want to do work on schistosomiasis at WashU, you're not going to, unless you're doing bench research, because we don't have patients with schistosomiasis. Can you find mentoring in this field? The mentoring doesn't have to be 2 doors down. The mentoring can be from all across the world, but you have to feasibly be able to find mentoring. Research is highly dependent on mentoring, and you will not be able. Very few people actually pull off a career without good mentoring. The next thing you have to look at is funding. This is where you have to decide, is this a field that has enough funding that's going to support me in my career? And this is also where, from my personal experience, I have to tell you, you're not going to get everything you want. So mycology notoriously has very little funding. And I still chose mycology. I still do mycology. But it is a known difficulty that I'm aware of before going into this process. And then, will you have access to patients, samples, et cetera? It's kind of what I talked about with the schistosomiasis. If I want to do research on histo in St. Louis, good. If I want to do research on cocci, not so good. So it's very difficult to say that. And then once you start doing the research, or once you will see opportunities, and these opportunities will just show up. You don't know what they are. They're going to be very different based on what you may have imagined you wanted to do. My research initially, the first grant I ever wrote was on Candida genomics. And I don't do any of that work because of the opportunities that I've had along the way. And it reminds me of my favorite Hemingway quote, which is, every day is a new day. It's better to be lucky, but I would rather be exact. Then when luck comes, you're ready. Because throughout your career, at some point here and there and in multiple different places, you're going to get opportunities. And what will define your career, and what I personally believe will define a career, is much less how many of those opportunities you get, but rather how much advantage you take of every opportunity that you get. And that's not to say that people who get more opportunities don't have advantage, because they certainly do. But really, the thing you have control over is how to take advantage of the opportunities you get. Next slide, please. Then we come to probably what is the most important part, your mentorship. Outside of your partner and family, your mentor may end up being the person who has the most impact on your life, definitely on your professional life. And it's really important to pick the right one. And my experience has been that in PhD programs, there's whole philosophies dedicated to how you choose a mentor. And on the MD side, we kind of just do it. And we often do it very poorly. So really, there are multiple ways to kind of choose a mentor. And that is a lecture in and of itself, one that I've given quite a few times, but to kind of shorten it into the scope of this presentation. You want to find somebody who does something similar to what you want to do. They don't necessarily have to do the same research. Let's say you want to do histo research. You don't necessarily have to have your primary mentor be a histo researcher. If you want to do research on, let's say, pick histoplasmosis, and you want to do administrative data research, well, maybe there's somebody in your hospital who does research on CHF using administrative data, and they can teach you how to do that. They can be a great mentor, even though they may not even know anything about histoplasmosis. And then you find a subject matter expert who doesn't even necessarily have to be there, who can help you with the questions in the field and introductions, et cetera. Maybe they're doing, research on histoplasmosis, but their research is using a lot of prospective cohorts, but you want to do administrative data. Well, those are good kind of fits. And then really a lot of it has to focus on making sure that your mentor-mentee relationship will be good. And there are such things as good mentors, and there are such things as bad mentors, but I prefer to think of it as more of as a specific mentor. And so how well will you get along? do you have the kind of personalities that mesh well? Some people just don't get along, and no matter how good they are, they may not be the best mentor for you. Do they give you the time that you need? There's a groups of people who often mentor, but they're maybe too senior to ever be able to give you the time that you need. Or there's some people who see mentorship as a way of getting free research work. And so really kind of avoid those kinds of things and probe in your discussions to find out what they think the relationship will look like. Um, will they provide you with the kind of support that you need? Will they defend you when you're in a place where you need defending? Will they be the kind of person who will introduce you at conferences and kind of not just introduce you at conferences, but say when they get an opportunity, let's say to be on an editorial advisory board or to review a paper or to give a talk, will they say, you know what? How about I pass on this one and like I have my mentee take this one? Or will they just take it all for themselves? So that's the kind of thing you have to try to feel out in your discussions with the person who's going to become your mentor. But at the same time, you also want to feel this out from their previous mentees because they're going to give you a more honest answer. Are they known for promoting their mentees, like I was saying before? And have their mentees been successful in the way you want to be successful? One of the things I talk about all the time is that all pathways, not all, but many different pathways are all good. Like there's nothing wrong with somebody wanting to go into private practice. But then the mentorship that I gear towards somebody going to private practice or going into industry or going into government regulatory work versus academic research are different kinds of mentorships. You provide them with the skills they need, the connections they need, and you gear it towards what they want. And then will you mesh well with that person? A big thing to discuss is what kind of work relationship do you want? It's one of those enthusiastic consent discussions of mentorship. And you really want to make sure that they will provide you with what you need. There's good mentors who are very good at kind of keeping you on track. And if that's what you need, fine. Then there are the kind of mentors who will give you tons of resources, tons of support, and they let you go and off you go. You do your thing, and they expect you to do great things. And then they're there to help you, and they more like bumper bowling kind of a thing where they protect you from going off the rails, but they're not really gonna micromanage you. So there's some people who want the micromanagement. There's nothing wrong with any of these. It's just you have to know who you are and you have to know who your mentor is and make sure that those things align. Next slide, please. Space in the field. This is also another spectrum that you really have to know about. So is the field overcrowded? Usually that means there's more funding. There's also more competition. In that case, it's not about necessarily coming up with a novel idea because all novel ideas will be had quickly. It's about being fast. But if, on the other hand, is a field that's too starved, maybe hard to find middle career people. This is kind of the way it is in mycology right now. There is a ton of people kind of at that late stage of their career, very few people, almost nobody in the middle career, and then very few people in the early career. That's a difficult field in a totally different way. Because that means that within 2 years of being faculty, you're now competing with your idols for funding. That can be difficult, but all things you have to be ready for, right? And then, is there a specific niche that you can find? And that's kind of the kind of the ending part of this presentation. Can you next slide, please? Funding. So yeah, as we talk about the funding is all of, there's many different places: NIH, CDC, DARPA, BARDA, industry, philanthropy, non-specific agencies like the Longer Life Foundation. As far as I'm concerned, as long as the strings are there are no strings attached, money is money, and you can use that money to make lives better for patients. But you need to know which one of these groups are interested in funding, because if they're not interested, you can waste a lot of time trying. And also, are you willing to trade less funding for more breathing work? Kind of what I was talking about, the difference between a crowded field and a starved field. Next slide, please. Then the other thing that's important is culture. Like, what does the culture look like in the field? Are people throwing elbows? Are they secretive? Or do they collaborate? Do people have drag out fights in literature? Is there a dominant person who kind of poo-poos everybody's work but not theirs? Is there a lack of middle? These are all things that you should look through. And I know this may feel overwhelming and you're not going to get it all right. These are all just things that you need to kind of look out for and kind of put these in the back of your head. And as you progress, kind of think, is trying to recognize what's happening in the field so that you know if this is the right field for you. Next slide, please. And then how do you make your own voice? There's a whole lecture, and if you email me, I will be happy to share it on YouTube. That's actually about writing, but I think it's a lot more about the writing, but more about how you function inside of a scientific field. Always remember the but. Your job as a scientist is to prove things wrong. We sometimes forget this, that the central hypothesis, the central concept of science is to prove things wrong. And so avoid saying things like, we want to get some data on, update our understanding on. Never say things like fellow project. Avoid when people say fellow or resident project, or should be able to get you an abstract. An abstract is about 85% of the work of a paper. Just go for something that's worthy of a paper. What you want to write and what you want to focus on is things that create tension. So that's why I said, remember the but. All the previous research has shown X. My research is showing Y. Our current understanding is that Y, but turns out it's in this situation that is not correct. So remember that but, because it's going to be really, really important of how you distinguish yourself. Prove your mentors wrong. Prove your idols wrong. Next slide. So finding your field is like picking the right place to live. It's an extensive balancing act, and you always have to keep reassessing it. But once you get there, don't be shy, make it your own, settle in, and make sure you prove that you are just as good as all of your idols. So with that said, thank you for your time, and I'd like to throw things back to Dr. Walk Clyburn.
Thank you, Andre. That was fantastic as usual. And I think that has encompassed a lot of the questions that we have. As a reminder to the audience, please use the Q&A button to ask questions at any point during the presentation. Now, as following in our part of our program, now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Roger Bedimo. Dr. Bedimo is a professor in the Department of Internal Medicine at UT Southwestern Medical Center and a member of the Division of Infectious Diseases and Geographic Medicine. He serves as an infectious disease section chief at the VA in North Texas Healthcare System, originally from Cameroon. Dr. Bedimo obtained his medical degree with honors at the University of Yaoundé after serving in District Chief Public Health in Cameroon. He moved to the US and earned master's degrees in parasitology at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, and then completed internal medicine residency training at the Wright State University, where he served as chief resident. He received advanced training through fellowship at infectious diseases at the University of Alabama and Birmingham, and he is the editor-in-chief of Open Form Infectious Disease. Dr. Bedimo, your microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walcolburn. And as Dr. Walcolburn just said, I've had a circuitous route to where I am today, and so do not feel afraid of making U-turns along the way, and that the same applies for your research endeavors. So next slide, please. So this is about crafting your unique research pathway, and I'd like to take over from where Dr. Spec left things. He guided you a little bit through deciding on what field to work on and how to make your voice within that field. And what I would like to follow up on is this, it's all about questions, and I will explain. Your first thing is identifying a research question. Once you've decided on the field, like what Dr. Spec guided you through, and then how to approach that question, how to formulate it, and how to develop your research pathway within that question. And I can tell you later that after you answer that question, that will lead to more questions. So it's a circuitous route. So next slide, please. Again, the hardest part of clinical research, which is what I mostly do, is the identification and formulation of the research question. Next slide. And how do you approach that research question? How to identify it? Be prepared and accept to have a unique view of the world. You will not see things the same way as other people because you're sitting in a different place. And so develop your unique focus and be unapologetic about it and accept it. The goal of scholarship is achieving mastery of a subject through comprehensive literature review, discussions, and meetings. And I will tell you later that you first have to master what is known before you decide on asking questions about what is not known. Be inquisitive and be skeptical. A scientist is first and foremost skeptical. When you hear something, even if you read it in an authoritative textbook or research paper, be willing to challenge it. And be creative. Imagine new ways of approaching old questions. There are technologies that come to the fore every day, and with that technology, those technologies, a possibility to re-examine issues that were thought to have been settled. Be ready to extrapolate from other fields. Borrow shamelessly from other fields. There are some research tools, research approaches, and ways to approach questions that have been well established in other fields. And in yours, you can just be ready to adapt what has been developed in others. Finally, be tenacious. Don't ever give up. You will hear Dr. Spec told you about the funding sources, but I can tell you the number one reason for not getting funded is giving up. A lot of people who got funding did not get it. Most people, the large majority actually, did not get it on the first try. So don't ever give up. Next slide, please. So we keep coming back to the questions to ask yourself, not necessarily to ask others. Ask yourself questions about where is the gap that I can explore. That question has to first and foremost be interesting to you first, because you need to be passionate about the question. Otherwise, it will be a trudge. And then that question has to be novel. They have to contribute new information and maybe confirm information that is out there. It has to be feasible. I will talk later about what resources you have in to allow you to answer the questions. It has to be ethical. Make sure that in answering that question, you're doing so in a way that does not infringe upon ethical guidelines. And then it has to be relevant. Will the results of what you're asking change things? Does it change how people think? Does it change how we manage a condition or how we study it? A failed experiment is not the one that fails to provide the desired result. So don't try to square to put a round peg in the square hole or vice versa. A failed experiment is one that fails to answer the question. So negative questions are just as relevant if you wanted to answer the question whether it's true or false. Next slide, please. So how do you identify a research question? How do you begin? With a comprehensive search of the literature. You have to master what's out there. It looks a bit silly to be asking a question that has already been answered. Then identify areas that are unresolved or areas where answers are based on thin evidence or flawed studies. You will be surprised how many preconceived notions are not backed by evidence. I would take an example for us infectious disease. If you are taking care of people with bacteria in the blood, bacteremia, you will realize that there were some established guidelines that are being challenged every day now. You have to treat this with a bactericidal antibiotic. You have to treat this with IV antibiotics. You have to treat it for this length of time. Be ready to challenge these notions and see if they're actually solidly grounded in evidence. And if they're not, you're in luck because now you've found a question you can ask. Now think of creative alternatives to current assumptions, especially if supported by lab work or success in other fields. Again, borrow shamelessly from other fields. I will show you later how as an example of borrowing from other fields. Now review ideas with experienced scientists with expertise in specific or related fields. Next slide, please. Now, a good research question, how do you know you have gotten one? Is one that cannot possibly be construed as meaning anything other than what you intended. I will give you an example. Next slide, please. So the next important step, therefore, in clinical research is identifying the resources available to answer that question. Next slide. And these are the resources. You really have time, money, patients to do the studies. Dr. Spec just mentioned to you about doing a schistosomiasis study in St. Louis and so on. That you have to know that these are precious resources. You may, many studies have failed because they did not get the patients they needed to study the question. And then you have your measures of evaluation. This is something that is incredibly important. We don't have time to delve in that today, but before you embark on your research, you want to make sure that you have identified the methods through which you could answer the question, including the statistical plan for it. Next slide, please. So how do you approach a question? A specific question should describe your resources, your patients. Describe the predictive variable or intervention. I want to see if X will lead to Y. X is associated with Y, or X causes Y. And then you have to describe that Y, i.e. the outcome variable. These are the three things. So for all three, you must be really, really specific. So specific that there is little chance that anyone will be able to think or construe your question to mean anything other than what you intended it to mean. That is the litmus test of a good research question. Next slide. So here's a question. Are vitamins effective in treating the common cold? Now, which vitamins? At what dose? For how long? How do you define the common cold? How do you know that you've treated it? More specific questions. Will vitamin C at a dose of 1,000 milligrams daily for 5 days reduce the severity of symptoms of nasal stuffiness during those 5 days in healthy people? You have been specific. No one can construe this as meaning anything other than what you meant. They're not going to try to do this with another condition, with another outcome measure, which is nasal stuffiness, with another type of patient than the one who have the common cold, with another intervention than vitamin C at 1,000 milligrams at 5 days, period. So that is what a research question is. It's a discipline to acquire when you want to craft your research pathway. Next. So, and once you've answered the question, really, it's time to start another question, because this is a wheel. You keep going there. There is the research question, there's the hypothesis that you have, then there's the actual study you do with the resources, patient time, and other resources. You collect the data, you find something from the data, and this is, you infer that that data means some truth in the universe. Next slide, please. So this is what you see. There is what you want to know, how you plan to find out, what you really do. It may not be the same thing because that depends on the resources you have at your disposal. And then what you observe, what you conclude, and from that conclusion, that inference, start the inquiry all over again of asking the questions. Next slide. And so that's it. The research question, the hypothesis, the actual study, the data in the study, the findings, and the inference. Next slide, please. So again, we start with mastering the literature on any topic that you want to study, identifying the research question, formulating the hypothesis, and then you have your resources at the bottom, the subjects, the outcomes measure, the variables or intervention that you want to study. Next slide, please. So I'm finished with a short example. This example is on a research question looking at HIV. Here's our question. We have population-based cohort study that looks at survival of people with HIV compared to uninfected control. And you see that over time, survival of people with HIV has improved, approximating the survival of people who do not have HIV, but a gap remains. What drives that survival gap? Next slide. And that is our question. Despite suppressive antiretroviral therapy, there remains a mortality gap between people with HIV and the general population. What drives that excess mortality risk? That's how you start. Then you get specific about how you want to measure that improved survival or that survival gap, and how you want to study the factors that might explain that gap. Next slide, please. So this is being more specific. These are the leading causes of death for people living with HIV and who have achieved virologic success with antiretroviral therapy. They're not dying from AIDS. They're dying from these things: malignancy, suicide, cardiovascular disease, liver disease. So good place to start. An inquisitive mind begs to know why we've controlled the virus, why these people are dying from these things. Next slide. And you define how you want to study this. You know, these are the things that might impact mortality in people with HIV. They came into HIV with risk factors that has to do with the behavior, the environment, and other things like smoking. And then the virus comes in. That virus causes inflammation and all that kind of stuff. And then you have to have them on anti-HIV treatment for them to survive any long. So you know that in my question now, what drives the excess mortality? I have to look at these three groups of factors, and then I move on to be much more specific about my question. Next slide, please. And so this is to finish that example. We look at the cardiovascular disease in people with HIV. You know, it's mattering of possible risk, but how do I want to look at it? Next slide, please. I want to look at it this way. HIV, you have to treat it with antiretroviral therapy, HART. And then these things can drive heterogeneity on the basis of other traditional risk factors. This is the kind of place where you want to be in to begin to study something that increased ASCVD risk. How do I account for it? I first need to look at the traditional risk factors and then factors that are specific to the disease process. And then your question will become narrower and more precise and more refined. Next slide, please. And that's how I want to ask my question, because this is my field of research: HIV, antiretroviral therapy, and the increased risk of non-communicable disease like cardiovascular disease. Next slide, please. So this is what I think that we can discuss, and we can entertain your questions about how you decide what field you want to go into. And what I spend more time addressing is how you identify your research question and how you approach it. And from there, we can be ready to answer other questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Bedimo. Could you and Dr. Spec please unmute and turn your videos for the Q&A portion? I think this has been a fabulous overview on about how we can do research. So we do have a couple of things. I guess one is, we use a lot of abbreviations. So There were a couple of questions about what BARDA and DARPA mean. So I guess these are people that, this are specifically BARDA is a Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agencies. And those were highlighted as way of where to get some extra funding as part of the government, especially if you're working on like bioterrorism. So for example, when SARS-CoV-1 started, BARDA, the BARDA came out and there was huge grants, and that's how part of the development for the pandemic COVID vaccine came out. So that's that was the first question, was more about a clarification on terms that were used. So this is a question for both Roger and Andre. It is how to collaborate with researchers when you have the cases, but not institutional funds. I guess you have a question and you want to start doing research, but there's no money.
So a lot of research starts with no money. You just do it. But the real question, I think, is if you have the cases, have the interest, but don't necessarily have the expertise, then the answer is you start asking. You start asking people locally, you start asking people who are not local, and say, this is a thing I want to do. Can you help me with it? And I think you'd be surprised at how many of us are willing to carve out time and effort to help, especially people who are younger and willing to go into the field.
Roger, do you have anything to add?
No, I totally agree with Andrej's answers. And I think that it's important to be clear-eyed going into research, that yes, it will take resources. And those resources, like we mentioned, could be time, could be, your energy, could be money, patience, and the like. And you have to take stock of all those resources. And I think that with perseverance, even in an institution where there's no specific fundings allocated to the type of work you want to do, you could make strides. And then as you making those strides, you can identify previously unidentified sources of support around you.
Yeah, and I think the other part is to think outside the box, right? So sometimes we're looking for infectious diseases, but they're, in hematology, or for example, I know one of my former fellows, they're doing research with the asthma because they're looking at ascariasis. So either lungs, so looking at other options could be another part. So I think sometimes we are boxed into just the standard without looking at other places around. What advice? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, especially for really early stuff, what's good to look for is there a foundation, like a patient organization or a foundation that looks at that kind of specific thing? Cystic Fibrosis Foundation changed cystic fibrosis because they kept young faculty alive in that K to R transition, which is a really hard transition. And so I think it's trying to get creative, and a night spent Googling may actually yield a lot more information than you think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think sometimes we try to draw our path of research in a straight line. And I think what it is that the path to research, just like anything in life, it's not a straight line. There's a lot of loopholes and there's a lot of ebbs and flows, right? So saying that, how can you, what advice would you give individuals who are just starting to integrate clinical roles with research? So, we talked about the funding, but now it's talking about time. When you have this heavy clinical, especially our fellows who will start their first year and they have maybe 80% clinical or 70% clinical, how can you start doing that?
Yeah, and this is a very important, yet not easy to answer question, especially in this environment of ours today, where people don't get as much quote unquote protected time. And we are on the one hand encouraging people to follow their passion, and if that passion involves scientific inquiry, and to follow it. However, and that resources, that is time, is not something that is readily available to them, as they have to carve out time of their own from the required clinical duties. I just think that it's important to take small bites in the beginning if you think that they can be compatible with the amount of clinical effort that you have. And as you are getting productive and in those small bites, you can grow your research depth and maybe broaden its portfolio. But starting small is probably the most important thing.
I think that's absolutely wonderful advice. The thing that I would add is something that I don't feel like I'm necessarily very good at, but it's learning to say no, and learning to say no early. There is a lot of work to be done in a university, and a university has millions of things that can be put on your CV that don't necessarily advance where you want to go. And so if you are overcommitted, the point is to not start sacrificing even more of your career to do stuff that you don't necessarily want to do. That's not to say that you can say that for everything, because there are certainly things you have to agree to help out, etc. But there certainly will be a need to learn to say no.
That is very important. Sometimes on our eagerness, is that we want to actually do everything. And that is like when you go to a buffet, you fill your plate and then you sit down and you can't eat it. So you start falling behind. So it's always hard to say no. I'm just like Andre, I'm like really bad at saying no. But you have to start knowing which opportunities line up with your goals. And that's where the mentoring is very important, as well as sponsoring, so you know which are the right things to go for and not kind of get distracted by the more fancy looking stuff that might not contribute to your career. So we have a couple of questions on the chat, and one, and they're kind of similar. One in the sense that it talks about how to get involved on research. The first one is about pharmacy. Is a pharmacy student who is at a school that they don't conduct research, and so and I presume that this is someone who is from the U.S. And they're inquiring about how to get involved in research. Because the second part to that is the second question, asking how to do research when you're a foreign medical graduate and you want to start doing that. So one is a US based person asking, how can I get into research? And the second is a foreign medical graduate, how to get into research.
So it's a lot easier if you're in the US. Find somebody who is doing the research you want to do. Doesn't have to be at your institution, and ask them, would you mentor me to do it at my institution if that's the only option you have, or could I come and learn? Could I spend some time with you? There's a lot of people who will have spots open, and if you don't ask, it doesn't happen, and if you ask, it might happen. And I would say, but for US foreign, from being outside of the US, there is no shortage of work that needs to be done outside of the US. And for that, I would like to, quick tell a story of a gentleman named Julio Zuniga, who reached out to me when he was a medical student in Honduras and wanted some help to do a research project in Honduras. And I mentored him for a couple of years. He did the work himself. He published in a wonderful journal called OFID. That was a really well-received paper, a very important paper that actually contributed to an understanding of Cryptococcus. And he loved it so much that he went on to get an MPH at University of Michigan. And he's now my postdoc. He works with me in our group, and I'm looking hopefully to transitioning him as soon as I can to faculty. And so there is pathways, but if you don't ask, you won't find them. And a good chunk of people you ask will ignore you. A good chunk of people will say no, but you just need one to say yes.
Yeah. Yeah, again, that's fantastic advice, Andre. I think that underlying Andre's response is the fact that collaborations are now easier across institutions and even across countries. So being in an institution that is not a big research institution and where you don't have access to faculty who are doing research, shouldn't discourage you from seeking that collaboration, mentorship from other institutions. The important thing is to stay true to your interests, and your passion with what you want to do. And as you dig deeper into that particular question, you will identify people who are involved in it, and you know, don't be shy contacting them even if they're not in your institution, because from this contact, as long as people are to feel your passion for the inquiry, as a recovering fellowship program director, I can tell you that what do we want to see in a mentee or trainee? There are three things. We want to see that they have the background that on which you want to build. And then what they want to see that you have the focus, and you're not, moving in a Brownian motion. And the research is very, very important in that. You have to have tunnel vision, narrow, laser focus on something you want to do. And when people see that, they will want to work with you. And the third and final, ingredient is the drive. You want to be self-propelled. Once you've identified your focus and people know that you go in that direction, you want to keep on moving and not wait to be pushed from behind. And these are the ingredients of someone who really have a commitment for succeeding in scholarly work. And I think that people along the way will identify that in you and be supportive of you.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. For the pharmacy student, I would say, you're starting your career. So one is the Society of Pharmacy, CIDP. They have, just like all societies, they've created mentorship groups, a way to communicate. There's a student co-op to be able. So when you go to a rotation, since you're pharmacy, you would talk to the pharmacists there and see what they have. And then just like Roger and Andre said, is the drive. You want to do something you're passionate about. I think we can speak all that sometimes people who don't do well in research is because they're doing someone else's passion and not theirs, right? And they lose interest, and it's just to put a filler on a CV, and that is just going to be kind of a idea of a disaster, because you have to feel it. You have to have that extra drive, especially when you get your first paper rejected or your first K grant, which happens a lot. You want to have that drive to say, yes, I want to continue because this is something I believe on and this is what I want to do. So it's easier if you have that. So definitely that is. For the foreign medical graduate, I think the approach that they wrote here, it is an approach that, just sending, trying to contact randomly or just through social media or emails that are very generic, sometimes might not be as productive. You really want to have like a key question. Just, if you sent out something that is very broad, we all get the emails, right? And so we also can tell that they're kind of mass generated. And so you really want to be specific. If you have someone that gives a talk, it's the best time is to approach them to discuss. There's some works that are, look at who does that type of work in your region, and that might also help a little bit throughout. So, kind of going a little bit more onto, before we end up is, how do you start with, how do you decide which is the most appropriate use base for the hypothesis about, like, talk about methodologies for clinical research? Do you, do you encourage your learners or your mentees to take special courses or ways to improve that?
So
Well,
I will say that, I spend a lot of, Roger, please go ahead, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, Andrej.
I actually devote, quite a bit of time to learning techniques with my fellows and or with my mentees, but at the same time, there are certainly, I don't want to recommend classes for the sake of classes, but I will really strongly suggest targeted classes that are specifically geared towards what they're interested in. That's aside from like a general basic methodology and statistics class. But I think it's also very important. The thing that's really difficult to translate research from one institution to another is the culture and the mentorship that comes with being in a lab, even a dry lab, where you sit and you discuss and you kind of critique each other's work. And I think the biggest benefit is in being in that group. And so not having one-on-one meetings is really helpful. Having group meetings is more helpful, as long as you make sure that you create a culture of inclusiveness and mutual assistance, because you don't want a culture where everybody's destroying one another's work, because that's not the point. The point is for everybody to make everybody else's work better through positive critique. I think that's the kind of the biggest driver.
Yeah.
So just, oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
No, I think, as there are other questions, I think Andrej's answer is great. Yeah, go ahead, Diana.
I was just gonna say, yeah, we're close to time, but I know Matthew had his hand raised earlier. Matthew, if you wanted to close us out with the last question, and you can
it's not really a question as much as sort of a commentary. I thought at first, great talk. I think you guys hit on a lot of the points that I talk to with my mentees and my partners who are mentoring and other people who are mentoring. One of the early points made was about a mentor, picking a mentor who, really understands how to be a mentor and whatnot. But one of the things that that I think has really impacted me as a mentor over the years, and that I think shows you among the best mentors, are people who were mentored themselves by a good mentor, right? I think that you could be a researcher, and as it was mentioned, there are people who are just looking for free work. There are people who are just looking for, to get that next paper out, etc., and less focusing on being a mentor. But I think the people who really had the good experience themselves of being mentored are all looking to pay that forward. And I say that all the time. And when I talk to my mentor, I tell him, I started with him as a high school student, eventually did my PhD with him. And I always say I'm always looking to pay forward what he did for me, because he set me on that path. So that was one thing. And the other thing I wanted to comment on that the second speaker had talked about, taking things from other disciplines and whatnot. And one of the things I tell my mentees all the time is that people do not read the literature broadly enough, right? They focus on their field, ID only, things like that. But the techniques we're using now and the interactions between multiple specialties and multiple fields really allows us to learn from and add to what we're doing based on what other people are doing that may not have any. I actually am working on a cure cardiology grant right now as the infectious disease person, because some of the work that I'm doing is really applying to that field. So I would say along that path, read the literature broadly. Do not focus solely on, do not only read CID, or JID or OFID, read JAMA, read New England Journal, and not just the ID articles there. Read them broadly.
Thank you so much. Well, we're just about time, so if there's any questions we missed, we will do our best to answer them via email. Thank you again, Dr. Bedimo and Dr. Spec, for your presentation, and I will pass it back to Ayanna to close us out.
Yes, thank you. Again, feel free to email me. You all should have my email address, but I'll follow up with you all. Well, the email address will be at the end of the presentation if you have any additional questions for our two fabulous speakers. And thank you, Dr. Sims, for closing us out on that fantastic note. Again, thank you, Dr. Roger Bedimo and Dr. Andrej Spec and Dr. Layla Watt-Colburn for moderating today's discussion. Thank you all for joining us and participating in the Q&A session. Also want to take a moment to just quickly recognize another IDSA Mentorship and Recruitment Subcommittee member, Dr. Shweta Anjan, who joined us today. So thank you for joining us. And if you wish to revisit the webinar or share it with others, we'll have it recorded and it'll be made available to you both on Cooper and on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So subscribe to our YouTube channel. And then our next webinar in our series is scheduled for Monday, February 19th, which is just 2 Mondays away. It's called Mastering Academic Journal Publishing. And we have some heavy hitters on that one as well. So please register. We'll put the registration link in the chat. And we will post about any other upcoming webinars on our social channels and on Cooper as well. So thank you all again and have a wonderful rest of your day.